What if the very thing you believe will bring someone back into your life is actually the same thing that is meant to bring you back to yourself? And what if no contact is not the emotional punishment you think it is, but a quiet psychological reset that most people completely misunderstand? Because right now, if you are thinking about an avoidant person, your mind is probably not calm. It is not stable, it is not free, it is caught in loops. One moment you feel hope, the next moment you feel rejection, one moment you think they will come back, the next moment you feel like you were never important at all. And in that emotional swing, something very important is happening inside your mind without you even realizing it. You are not just missing a person, you are becoming emotionally dependent on unpredictability. And that is where everything starts to break you without you noticing it. Most people hear the phrase no contact and immediately turn it into a strategy, a way to get attention. A silent message meant to trigger curiosity in the other person, a waiting game disguised as strength. But when the attachment is with someone who is avoidant, this mindset becomes even more dangerous because it keeps your emotional system locked on the outcome instead of your healing. And that is the first truth you need to face. No contact is not a message you send to someone else. It is a message you finally stop sending to yourself through them. Think about what has been happening before you chose silence. The constant checking, the overthinking, the reading between every small interaction, the emotional spikes when they come close, and the crash when they pull away again. This cycle is not random. It is how emotional conditioning begins. Your brain starts associating intensity with connection and inconsistency with desire. This is not love forming in a healthy way. This is your nervous system adapting to instability. And avoidant dynamics are powerful because they create exactly that. They give just enough closeness to keep hope alive and just enough distance to keep anxiety activated. It becomes a loop where you are always trying to solve something that is never stable enough to solve. So when no contact begins, something unexpected happens. The silence does not feel peaceful at first. It feels loud. Because your mind, which was trained on emotional unpredictability, suddenly has nothing to predict. No new signals, no new hope spikes, no emotional rewards. And the brain, which was feeding on that cycle, begins to panic. It starts to tell you stories. It says, maybe you should reach out. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe they are thinking about you right now. Maybe this is the moment you lose them forever. But what it is really doing is reacting to withdrawal. Yes, withdrawal. Because emotional attachment is not just a feeling, it is a chemical pattern. And when that pattern is interrupted, the mind tries to restore it even if it was hurting you. This is the part most people misunderstand. They think the discomfort means they are losing someone. But in reality, the discomfort often means they are losing an attachment that was built on inconsistency, not stability. And here is where the deeper truth begins to appear. No contact is not about keeping an avoidant person away. It is about breaking the emotional grip they still have on your internal world, even in their absence. Because if you are still hoping, still waiting, still emotionally reacting in silence, then you are not truly in no contact. You are in delayed attachment. And that is why this message is not about strategy. It is about awareness. You cannot heal in the same pattern that created the attachment. You cannot find clarity while still emotionally negotiating with someone who only shows up in fragments. And you cannot regain your self-respect while your nervous system is still outsourced to their behavior. So the real question is not, will they come back? The real question is, why does their absence still control your presence? And this is where everything begins to shift. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the emotional loop, you cannot pretend it is love in the same way again. And once your awareness rises above the cycle, your behavior starts to change naturally. That is the beginning of reclaiming yourself. And if you stay with this video until the end, you will understand something most people never realize about no contact and avoidant dynamics. Not as a trick, not as a strategy, but as a psychological turning point that changes the way you see attachment, love, and your own emotional identity forever. When you begin to see the emotional pattern clearly, something subtle but powerful starts to happen inside your awareness. The confusion that once felt overwhelming begins to lose its grip. Not because the situation has changed, but because your interpretation of it starts to evolve. And this is where most people miss the real meaning behind stepping away from contact with someone who is emotionally inconsistent. Because the deeper purpose was never about creating distance as an emotional reaction. It was about creating space where your inner world is no longer constantly shaped by someone else's unpredictability. It is about removing yourself from a cycle where your emotional state depends on another person's availability, timing, or mood shifts. When someone is inconsistent in closeness, your mind begins to operate in a survival-like pattern. It starts scanning for meaning in small actions. It starts overvaluing rare moments of attention and underestimating long periods of silence. Over time, this creates a distorted internal system where stability feels unfamiliar and uncertainty feels normal. And that is exactly how emotional dependence strengthens without being noticed. So when separation begins, the real function of it is not external, it is internal recalibration. Your emotional system starts to lose its constant triggers. The highs and lows that once defined your day begin to fade. At first, this feels uncomfortable because your brain has been trained to respond to those fluctuations like rewards and warnings. But slowly, something important starts to surface. You begin to notice that your reactions are not as automatic as they used to be. There is a small pause where impulse once existed. That pause is where transformation begins. Because in that space, you are no longer reacting from conditioning. You are beginning to observe it. The true intention behind creating distance is to interrupt the cycle of emotional reinforcement that kept you locked in anticipation. When attention comes unpredictably, the mind becomes highly focused on the next possible moment of connection. This creates a loop where expectation becomes more powerful than reality, and reality itself becomes less important than the hope of change. But once that loop is removed, your attention no longer has an external anchor. It begins to drift inward, and at first, that inward shift feels empty, because for a long time, your emotional focus was projected outward. You were measuring your worth through responses, timing, and behavior that was never consistent enough to build certainty. Now that measurement system collapses, and what replaces it is not immediate peace, but awareness. Awareness of how much energy was spent trying to interpret silence. Awareness of how often your emotional state depended on waiting. Awareness of how frequently you adjusted your expectations just to avoid disappointment. And slowly, this awareness starts to change your internal priorities. You begin to recognize that emotional stability was never something you received from the outside. It was something you abandoned internally while trying to secure connection elsewhere. And this realization does not come with comfort. It comes with clarity that feels sharp at first, but necessary. Because the real purpose of stepping away is not to influence another person's behavior. It is to disconnect your identity from their inconsistency. When emotional attachment is tied to unpredictability, your self-worth starts to fluctuate without logic. A good moment feels like validation. A silent moment feels like rejection. And over time, you lose the ability to remain steady within yourself. Your emotional center moves outside of you, anchored to reactions you cannot control. So distance becomes a way of pulling that center back, not through force, but through withdrawal of attention. As attention shifts back inward, something else begins to weaken. The urgency to interpret every action starts fading. The need to analyze meaning in silence begins to reduce, and the emotional intensity that once felt consuming starts to lose sharpness. This does not happen because feelings disappear, but because the reinforcement loop is no longer active. And when reinforcement stops, attachment begins to lose its compulsive power. This is where a critical shift takes place in understanding. What once felt like deep emotional connection begins to reveal its unstable foundation. It becomes clearer that intensity was not the same as security, longing was not the same as compatibility, and emotional activation was not the same as emotional alignment. These distinctions matter because they redefine what you were actually responding to. You were not just responding to a person. You were responding to a pattern that activated hope, anxiety, and anticipation in repeated cycles. And now, with distance in place, that pattern loses its control over your nervous system. Gradually, your mind begins to experience moments where it is not waiting for anything, moments where there is no emotional expectation attached to time. These moments might feel unfamiliar at first, but they are essential, because they represent the return of internal neutrality, where your emotional state is no longer constantly pulled in different directions by external behavior. This neutrality is not emptiness. It is restoration. It is the beginning of returning to yourself without distortion. And in that process, you start to notice something even more important. Your thoughts become less reactive. Your emotional responses become less immediate, and your focus begins to expand beyond a single person or situation. Life starts to feel less narrowed and more open again, even if slowly. That openness is the real objective of this entire process. Because once your internal world is no longer dependent on unpredictable emotional input, you regain the ability to choose where your attention goes. You are no longer pulled by uncertainty. You are guided by clarity. And that shift, although quiet, marks the beginning of reclaiming emotional independence in its truest form. As that internal clarity begins to settle, another layer of truth starts to surface, and it is not always comfortable to face. Because when emotional intensity fades, the mind is left with space that was previously filled with waiting, interpreting, and hoping. And in that space, reality becomes harder to avoid. This is where many people try to escape the process. Not because they want to return to pain, but because silence forces reflection. And reflection often reveals patterns that were ignored while emotions were louder than logic. You start to notice how much of your energy was spent trying to decode behavior that never became consistent enough to rely on. You begin to see how often your focus was directed toward moments that were rare, instead of the overall pattern that was clear all along. And this is the point where emotional honesty becomes unavoidable. Because when attention is no longer pulled outward, it turns inward. And what it finds is not just attachment, but investment. Investment of time, emotion, imagination, and expectation. You realize that a large part of your mental space was occupied by something that never offered stability, only fluctuation. And that realization can feel heavy, not because of loss, but because of understanding. Understanding changes perception permanently. At this stage, the mind begins to reevaluate what it once labeled as connection. It starts to separate moments of closeness from the overall pattern of inconsistency. And slowly, a new awareness forms. You begin to see that your emotional involvement was not built on steady foundation, but on intermittent reinforcement, where unpredictability created stronger attachment than consistency ever could. This type of attachment is powerful because it trains expectation rather than satisfaction. It keeps the mind focused on what might happen next instead of what is actually happening. And over time, that anticipation becomes more influential than reality itself. You are no longer responding to presence, but to possibility. Once this becomes clear, the emotional structure begins to weaken. Not suddenly, but gradually, as the mind stops assigning meaning to every fluctuation. What once felt like signals of importance start to lose significance. The urgency to interpret behavior starts dissolving, and the emotional weight attached to waiting begins to lift, even if slowly. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is recalibration of perception, because when perception changes, attachment loses its original form. During this phase, something subtle but important happens. The attention that was previously locked onto another person begins to redistribute. At first, it may feel unfamiliar to direct focus anywhere else, but over time, small moments of awareness begin to return to your own life, your own decisions, your own state of mind. And with that shift, a new realization appears. The energy that was once consumed by emotional uncertainty was never just about affection. It was also about identity. Somewhere along the way, emotional availability from another person became linked to personal worth. So when it was inconsistent, it did not just create confusion about them, it created confusion about self. That is why the withdrawal feels so intense at first. It is not only separation from a person, but separation from a mirrored identity that was shaped by their responses. And when that mirror disappears, you are left without external reflection, which forces you to confront who you are without that feedback loop. This is where real rebuilding begins. Because without external validation cycles, you are no longer reacting to emotional signals. You are beginning to observe your own internal state without distortion. Thoughts become less reactive, emotional spikes become less frequent, and the need for constant interpretation starts to fade. In this space, something important starts to grow: stability that is not dependent on external behavior, a sense of grounding that does not fluctuate with silence or attention. This stability is not instant, and it does not feel dramatic. It builds quietly through repeated moments of choosing awareness over reaction. And with each moment of awareness, the emotional grip loosens further. What once felt like confusion begins to transform into insight. You start recognizing how attachment formed not because of consistent care, but because of inconsistent engagement. And that recognition changes how you interpret past experiences. Instead of searching for meaning in individual moments, you start seeing the entire pattern. Patterns create clarity, and clarity reduces emotional dependence. At this point, the mind begins to detach from the idea that inconsistency can eventually turn into stability if given enough time. That belief weakens as evidence becomes undeniable through reflection. You begin to understand that waiting was not leading toward resolution, but extending emotional uncertainty. And once that understanding settles, emotional urgency naturally declines. There is also a shift in how memories are processed. Instead of triggering strong emotional reactions, they start becoming observational. They no longer pull you into longing or confusion as strongly as before. They are still present, but they lose their ability to control present emotional state. This is a sign that internal restructuring is taking place, because emotional freedom is not forgetting. It is no longer being controlled by remembrance. As this stage deepens, the focus gradually shifts away from external validation and toward internal consistency. You begin to value calmness over intensity, predictability over emotional highs, and self-alignment over uncertain connection. This is not a forced decision. It is a natural outcome of awareness, because once the nervous system stops chasing instability, it begins to prefer balance. And in that preference, a new direction emerges. A direction where emotional energy is no longer spent on decoding mixed signals, but on building a stable internal foundation. A foundation that does not collapse when someone is absent, silent, or inconsistent. That is the beginning of emotional independence becoming real, not just understood. As that internal foundation starts to form, another realization slowly rises to the surface, and it changes the way the entire experience is understood. Because once emotional dependence begins to weaken, the mind becomes capable of seeing things without distortion. What once felt like confusion begins to look more like a clear sequence of patterns that were always there, just not fully acknowledged. And this is where perspective shifts in a deeper way. You begin to understand that the strongest emotional pull was never created by stability. It was created by inconsistency that kept attention alive. The mind was constantly adjusting, constantly trying to predict the next shift, constantly searching for reassurance in behavior that never stayed the same for long. And that constant adjustment created a mental habit of overfocus on small moments, overanalysis of minimal signals, overinterpretation of silence. This pattern does not fade instantly. It dissolves gradually as awareness grows stronger than reaction. And in that gradual shift, something important becomes visible. The emotional charge that once felt overwhelming was not coming from connection itself, but from uncertainty attached to it. Uncertainty is what keeps the mind engaged. It forces anticipation, it creates mental loops, it makes the brain believe that clarity is just one more moment away. And so attention becomes fixed, even when the experience itself does not provide stability. When that cycle weakens, attention begins to loosen its grip. At first, this feels unusual. The absence of mental urgency can feel unfamiliar, almost like something important is missing. But what is actually happening is the removal of psychological tension that was mistaken for emotional depth. Without that tension, thoughts begin to slow down. Reactions become less immediate. Internal space starts to open. And in that space, self-awareness becomes more present. You start noticing how often your emotional state was reacting instead of choosing, how frequently your attention was directed by external behavior instead of internal direction. And slowly, a new understanding forms. Much of what was experienced as emotional connection was actually a cycle of expectation management, expectation of change, expectation of return, expectation of consistency that never arrived. When those expectations are no longer actively fueled, the emotional structure loses its intensity, and what remains is clarity without pressure. This clarity is not loud. It does not create excitement. It creates grounding. And that grounding allows you to see the situation from a position that is no longer emotionally reactive. From this position, something becomes undeniable. The connection was never balanced in the way it was imagined. There was always a mismatch in emotional availability. One side was reaching, the other was retreating. And this imbalance created a dynamic where effort was constantly directed toward closing a gap that was not being equally met. When this becomes visible, the emotional narrative changes. It is no longer about searching for meaning in every interaction. It becomes about recognizing the structure of the interaction itself. And once structure is understood, emotional confusion begins to lose its authority. This is where detachment starts becoming stable rather than temporary, not because feelings are suppressed, but because interpretation changes. The mind stops assigning significance to unpredictability. It stops treating inconsistency as something that requires decoding. Instead, it begins to recognize it as a pattern that speaks for itself without needing further explanation. And in that recognition, emotional energy starts returning inward. This return is subtle at first. It shows up in moments where thinking about the situation no longer consumes attention for long periods. It appears when daily life starts regaining space that was previously occupied by mental replay. It grows when focus shifts toward personal routines, decisions, and present experience without constant interruption from emotional analysis. As this continues, something else begins to strengthen quietly. Self-reliance, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of internal stability that does not require emotional confirmation from outside sources. This stability forms through repeated experiences of choosing awareness over reaction. Each moment of non-reactivity reinforces a new pattern in the mind, and with repetition, patterns become identity. At this stage, emotional triggers lose their intensity. Situations that once created strong internal responses now feel less consuming. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer dictate emotional state in the same way. There is space between thought and reaction, and in that space, control returns. Control not over others, but over internal direction. This is a critical shift because it marks the transition from emotional dependence to emotional autonomy. And autonomy changes how experiences are processed moving forward. Instead of being pulled into cycles of anticipation, the mind begins to evaluate situations with greater distance and clarity. And with that distance, new understanding becomes possible. You begin to see that emotional attachment does not always equal emotional alignment. That intensity is not a reliable measure of compatibility, and that moments of closeness do not guarantee long-term consistency. These insights do not come from theory. They come from reflection after distance has removed distortion. As this understanding deepens, the emotional narrative that once felt central begins to lose importance. It does not disappear suddenly. It fades as attention no longer reinforces it, and as it fades, mental space expands. In that expanded space, something more stable begins to grow, a sense of direction that is no longer based on emotional reaction, but on internal clarity. Decisions begin to feel less influenced by uncertainty. Emotional stability becomes less dependent on external presence, and personal focus starts becoming stronger than attachment patterns. This is the stage where transformation becomes noticeable not just internally, but in behavior. Because when internal patterns change, external actions naturally follow.